these toward, right? And I think that there's a kind of classic model of archival research that we can that is undergoing change, and those of you who are working in the archive now are helping us think differently about how we can constitute the archive as a sort of as a multi-sided and distributed set of practices as well. And you encounter this a lot when you work outside of the U.S., I mean, which is a really heavily enumerated set of practices, as opposed to, you know, if you work in India or if you work in China or if you work in the Philippines, where they're, you know, historians have had to deal for a very, very long time with the absence of that which we thought of as the official records. One of the reasons that subaltern studies came up the way it did, you know. So I think that this is really an opportunity to innovate, sort of in a historiographic sense as well.
Yeah. Actually, Nitin, I was wondering, you know, the question of what is an industry, where do you find it? I think that so much of that is at the crux of it too that you raised. So I was wondering if, since you've been looking at the moment where the Indian film industry became an industry, if there is any self-consciousness about keeping a record now, because I didn't find very much of that. There are other repercussions of that, but that has always been, I mean, my Hollywood envy is the abundance that I can see of records. I mean, where you go to a culture where you don't have bound scripts, you don't have, you know, everything's kind of word of mouth. Your whole argument about informalities and how to track them, how they make their presence visible. I mean, has the coming in of an industry even created that sensibility? Because I didn't quite actually see it. Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, partially, it's what Toby said. I mean, and also Jen talking about the way in which certain things are monetized. So, you know, records of things, especially actual shooting records, that can show up on DVDs, or it can show up in compilations, or it can show up in other different venues. Those things, I think, are kept more assiduously than they once were. I think that's one of the great myths about the sort of shift to corporatization, the so-called corporatization of Indian media, is that there really is not, anywhere near the level of records that, certainly there are, as businesses are incorporated. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's just, things are probably written down more. I mean, there's all this idea of verbal contracts, etc., and there's a lot of that still going on. Things are written down more. Are they kept after they're written down, and where do you find them? There's a different ethos, and I think this is one of the reasons why, and you know this because of your own work as well, in terms of the South Asian context, why historiography and its relationship to the archive has taken a kind of different turn. And those of us who are working on the industry in the Indian context, we begin with the absence of information, right? And you will not get, it doesn't exist, right? It will not be released at some later date. It's not in the process of coming out. It is not present. What do you do now? And this is the sort of first place you have to start. And again, it's I don't mean to sound too existentialist about it. You stare into the abyss and, you find. I think the alternative is then you have these rigid state reports which come from a very specific perspective.
Right.
So where it is actually rationalized, discussed, is from a very definite perspective of this industry, how it needs to be taxed.
That's right. That's right.
That's from the outside and the statist perspective, so you have to start decoding it and
That's right.
try to understand industry.
That's right. And I mean, India is one of those places that really has produced a preponderance of state reports, right? But we know when you look, you look through these reports, they're hundreds of pages long. Then you sort of look in the back and you say, how did you comprise the evidence upon which this report was based? And there's a number of famous ones, 1927, 1951, 1960, etc., that we all refer to. You go in the back, Appendix B, and you'll find out that 15,000 questionnaires were sent out. 127 were returned. This is nowhere up front, right? And this entire assumption about how the industry operated at a particular time is based on a response rate of, 1-2%. And this is what, you have to deal with.
Okay. We have time for one more question. Yeah, Eric?
Questions. And actually, our caterers are running a bit late. So maybe this question leads into another.
Okay.
Have time for
stretch.
So this is, people will remember that 1958 was the only televised occasion of the Academy Awards when it ended too early. In fact, an hour and a half early. And Jerry Lewis had to ad-lib, so take it away, Eric.
My question ties into something you were sort of talking about earlier in regards to the trade journals. And my question is really about the relationship, what you see the relationship is between academic media studies, media industry studies, and like, entertainment business journalism. And it's a question that's coming from a couple of places. One is sort of noticing scholars both sort of, trash, variety, it's just a bunch of press releases, all the standard things we're familiar with, a lot of truth there. But then also the truth that a lot of people, including myself, will go and cite variety. When you look at the footnotes, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, that's where a lot of the data is coming from. And the second sort of place the question's coming from is also that feeling of going to conferences and you listen to a presentation and it's addressing the contemporary industry and it sort of feels like something that you did read in the Hollywood Reporter or LA Times, like except 2 or 3 years before. In that sense that actually the reporter who was sort of covering it at that time was doing sort of a more rigorous job than the person who's presenting it in this academic context.
Welcome to Television Studies at the CMS. Claim your prize.
Yeah, exactly. So my question is about what is that relationship between entertainment, business journalism, and media industry studies, and sort of how can we as scholars that are doing this kind of work really create something that's rich and different, and where we're not just giving a talk that was in the Wall Street Journal 3 years earlier?
It's a great question.
Well, I think what you're saying is there's a binary in a way. One is absolute skepticism, but in a slightly hypocritical mode, because in fact the footnotes are all the Los Angeles Entertainment Industry Development Corporation or an adumbration of that in Hollywood Reporter. And then the other side of the binary is almost being not necessarily a spokesperson for the industry, a fan who's just mouthing the rhetoric of the program or the show or the series or whatever it might be, but actually just mouthing what has been in turn re-summarized by some reporter, right? And I do think those are very real problems, both of them. And I said earlier that I felt I'd been guilty of the somewhat uncritical use of numbers because I was so happy ever to get them. And what I try to do, though, is engage in a sort of triangulation. It must be my inner Bill Clinton again, my wagging finger, my inner David Gergen meeting my inner Ludwig Wittgenstein, meeting my inner truck driver, which is a kind of marriage made in hell. So I wouldn't advise your being inside my brain when it takes place. But when it does, it's this attempt at triangulation. In other words, it's what a lot of social scientists try to do when they think they're in a sphere of uncertainty, which is to establish all kinds of different questionnaires, questions, answers, data, that appear roughly to be about the same thing, even if overtly they're not, that appear roughly to be measuring the same thing, and see how much they appear to be at variance. It's like what you do when there's a statistical rule change in the gathering of numbers in the census or something, and suddenly there's an uptick of whatever. It's the kind of stuff that the mugging studies showed in Britain in the 70s that the National Deviancy Conference did, that gave birth to a lot of Stuart Hall's work, where the invention of a category that becomes a problem sees an uptick in certain kinds of numbers. It doesn't necessarily correlate with an uptick in the conduct that is allegedly described by it, right? So the thing is to try to find as many different sources as possible that appear not to be drawing just on the same source themselves, that seem to be talking about the same kind of thing. Yeah? That's what I think is really important. And also, especially when it comes to new media things, one of the good sides to the breakup of the industrial model, the breakup of Fordism, if you like, the breakup of there being archives that are available, whether you think it's technological or you think it's industrial, because of there being, however many thousands of little companies with fewer than 10 people in the hinterland of California who are making TV, music, whatever it might be. One of the advantages of that is that a lot of those people really want to tell stories and are not frightened like big corporate executives are, and are genuinely puzzled and fascinated by when they get their same briefings we do every morning from Media Bistro or Video News or any of those people who purport to know what's happening in the industry and have numbers, you know, media research briefs, all that kind of stuff. And they like, in my experience, to talk about, at least in some level of generality, but with some specificity in many cases, how they think they're making their money. You know, like how many of their programs really are being watched on telephones, and how many of their programs really are being downloaded on iTunes. They can actually know that in greater reliability than I can, and they're often prepared to share it. So I think it's partly about being prepared to talk to the little people, as it were, as well as the big people, but also trying to get this multi-sided corroboration going about the questions, the questioners, the apparent answers. And then when you, as is often the case, get incommensurability, accept that there is incommensurability, but some of this is accident, and some of it is obfuscatory and partially deliberate. So it's really about taking numbers not as being fiendishly exciting or fiendishly intimidating, but, as I said earlier, as texts with a need to read them, to be treated with the same suspicion and love as any other kind of text.
To add one quick thing to that, one of the questions that Ellen had asked us is to think about how to do work in Los Angeles and taking advantage of your particular vantage point. And I think talking to journalists is a good idea. We forget to do that. You know, we think about, well, who our sources are going to be. We're going to look at their stories, or we're going to try and get into Jack Valenti's office, etc. But what about talking to journalists? Don't just read what they write, but actually using them and not their writing as our sources. I think that's something we could do a much better job of. I mean, I'm yet to see the presentation at SCMS where there's somebody who comes out and says, you know, I did an ethnography of film and media journalists, and tried to. Here's a massive constituency. We all read them. They get delivered to our email inbox every day. We just pass over that name at the byline, right? And these people are living in our community. You know, let's give them a call. You might want to talk to us.
And also, if you go to any kind of industry event or conference like NatP, I just went to another one, like a smaller one in LA. I can't remember what it's called. But these kind of gatherings, I see a lot. The journalists are always there, right? And there you have they're just they're working, but they're pretty accessible. And they're pretty happy to talk to scholars. And I've talked to a whole bunch of them there, and they can't believe that I know their name. You know, they can't believe that scholars read their bylines and know who they are and remember stories that they've written. And they're very happy to talk to you if you have any clue at all, which you do if you're reading their stuff. So I think, you know, any of these industry gatherings and conferences is another great place to find sources.